There's a hill in southeastern Turkey where a farmer's plow kept catching on stone. Not rocks, carved stone. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt walked that hill and understood in about 10 minutes what a Chicago survey team had walked past in 1963 and filed as a medieval cemetery. Under his feet were pillars, 16 tons each, carved with foxes, vultures, scorpions, and human hands wrapping around toward a belt. And they were 11,600 years old. That is not a typo. That date makes Göbekli Tepe 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. Older than writing. Older than the wheel. Older than pottery, farming, cities, metal, and every single thing our textbooks say you need before you can organize hundreds of people to quarry, move, and raise multi-ton monoliths in the middle of nowhere. Hunter-gatherers built it. That is the mainstream position. And it is the mainstream position because there is no alternative on the table. There are no houses, no storage pits, no irrigation, no civilization anywhere near it that we can point to and say, there, that's who did this. A monument that requires an organized society built by people who supposedly had no organized society. But that's not the part that breaks the timeline. The part that breaks the timeline is what they did to it. Around 8000 BCE, someone deliberately buried the whole complex. Not abandoned, buried. They backfilled the enclosures with tons of rubble and soil by hand, on purpose, and walked away. That is why it survived in such astonishing condition. And that is why nobody found it for 10,000 years. Somebody wanted this thing to stay hidden. And they were willing to do an enormous amount of work to make sure of it. Now hold that date, 11,600 years ago, because there is a text written by the most famous philosopher in Western history that names a specific year for a global catastrophe. And when you convert it, you get roughly 9,600 BCE. The same window. Not close. The same window. Plato said the survivors of that catastrophe scattered. He said, they carried their knowledge into the mountains. He said civilization had to start over, and that the people who restarted it remembered things they could no longer explain. So here is what we're going to do. We're going to look at what Plato actually wrote, not the myth, the document. We're going to look at 3 physical clues left in the ground, in the ice cores, and in the human genome that all point at the same catastrophic window. And we're going to end at a site that has been confirmed to exist by 3 independent teams that nobody has been allowed to open. Start with the text, because almost everyone gets it wrong. Plato wrote 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, around 360 BCE. In them, an Athenian statesman named Solon travels to Egypt, to a city called Sais, and speaks with priests. And one of those priests says something to him that is, honestly, insulting. He tells Solon that the Greeks are children, that they have no old traditions, no knowledge gray with age. Why? Because, the priest says, your people have been destroyed and reborn so many times, you never keep records long enough to remember. That is the setup. And it is not a fairy tale opening. It is a complaint about data loss. Then, the priest gives Solon the numbers, 9,000 years before Solon's time. An island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which is the Strait of Gibraltar. Larger than Libya and Asia combined, by the geography the Greeks used. Concentric rings of water and land. Walls faced in red, white, and black stone. A metal called orichalcum that gleamed like fire. And an end that came in a single day and night of misfortune, when the island sank and the sea in that place became impassable mud. For decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic, a political fable. Plato inventing a bad guy so Athens could look noble. But that explanation has a problem. The fable reading requires Plato to have invented a date, and then to have invented it in the one narrow window, when the planet actually did come apart. 9,000 years before Solon lands you at roughly 9,600 BCE. And 9600 BCE is not an arbitrary number in geology. It is one of the most violent transitions in the last 100,000 years of Earth's history. Plato had no ice cores, no sediment records, no radiocarbon. He picked the number out of an Egyptian temple archive, and the number landed on a real event. Here's where it gets strange. Clue 1. The Greenland ice. Ice cores are the closest thing this planet has to a black box recorder. Snow falls, traps air, compresses into annual layers, and you can count them like tree rings. Drill deep enough, and you can read the temperature of the atmosphere year by year, going back tens of thousands of years. The cores show something that should not be physically possible. Around 10,900 BCE, the world had been warming out of the last ice age, and then it slammed backward. Within decades, the northern hemisphere plunged back into near glacial conditions and stayed there for roughly 1,200 years. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic flower whose pollen shows up in European sediment right when the forests die back. Then, at approximately 9,700 BCE, it ended. And it did not end gradually. The Greenland cores show temperatures jumping as much as 10 degrees Celsius in a span that some researchers read as a single human lifetime. And other readings compress even tighter than that. Think about what that actually means on the ground. The ice sheets covering North America and Europe, sheets kilometers thick, did not politely melt. They collapsed. Meltwater lakes larger than any lake alive today burst their ice dams and drained into the oceans in catastrophic pulses. Global sea level did not creep. It surged. Over the full post-glacial period, the oceans rose more than 120 meters, and a significant amount of that came in sharp, violent steps. 120 meters. Stand on any coastline you like and imagine the water 40 stories over your head. Every coastline on Earth in 9,600 BCE is now underwater. Every harbor, every fishing settlement, every port, every low-lying plain where humans have always preferred to live is sitting in the dark under the continental shelf. We have not surveyed it. We have barely looked. And Plato's island? He said it sank, and he said the sea in that place became impassable mud. Not blown up, not burned, drowned, and then left as shallow shoal. Now hold that against the date the priests gave Solon. The end of the Younger Dryas is dated to roughly 9,700 BCE. Plato's catastrophe is dated to roughly 9,600 BCE. Two sources that could not possibly have known about each other, an Egyptian temple record and a Greenland ice sheet, landing inside a century of each other. Plato wasn't inventing. He was recording something. If you want to know what else that century did to this planet, subscribe, because this channel investigates the buried evidence every week, and this story goes much deeper than a date. Clue 2, and this is the one that turned an argument into a fight. Something started the Younger Dryas. For a long time, the answer was melt water disrupting the Atlantic currents. Then, in 2007, a research team proposed something else. An impact. Fragments of a comet detonating over or striking the North American ice sheet, triggering continental-scale fires and a cascade of climate collapse. They found a layer, a thin black mat of sediment, showing up at sites across North America and beyond, right at the boundary. And in that layer, microspherules, tiny melted glass beads that form at temperatures higher than anything a wildfire produces. Nanodiamonds, platinum spikes that don't match the Earth's crust. The platinum matters. Platinum is rare in surface rock and common in certain meteorites. In 2013, researchers found a platinum anomaly in the Greenland ice core at the Younger Dryas boundary, not in a disputed dig site, in Arizona, in the ice, in the record that nobody can accuse of being contaminated by a bad shovel. Mainstream geology pushed back hard, and it should have. Extraordinary claims. teams failed to replicate the spherules. Papers were published calling the whole thing dead. Papers were published calling it confirmed. Reviewers accused each other of sloppy sampling. The impact hypothesis became, for years, career poison. Young researchers were warned off it. That is not a conspiracy. That is science being ugly in public. But notice the shape of it. A hypothesis that would require rewriting the end of the Ice Age and the origin of agriculture met exactly the resistance you'd predict. And the evidence kept refusing to die. And there's a detail inside it that almost nobody mentions. If that impact happened, the survivors saw it. Human beings were standing on this planet in 10,900 BCE. They watched the sky come apart. They watched the coastlines eat their villages over the following centuries. Whatever they were before that, they were something else after. Which brings us to the third clue, the one you can't argue with, because it's carved in stone and dated by the dirt that buried it. Göbekli Tepe. Go back to those pillars, T-shaped monoliths, up to 5.5 meters tall, arranged in rings inside rings, the outer circle of stones, and inside them, two massive central pillars, standing apart from the rest. Concentric rings of stone, raised in the same window Plato dated his drowned city of concentric rings. The pillars are not abstract. They have arms, human arms, carved in low relief, running down the sides and folding hands across the front, with belts and loincloths. These are figures. Someone stylized the human body into a monolith 11,000 years ago and did it with total confidence, like they'd done it before. And there is no learning curve at Göbekli Tepe. That is the thing that keeps archaeologists up at night. The oldest enclosures, the deepest layers, are the most sophisticated. The later ones are smaller and cruder. The site does not start simple and improve. It starts at peak and degrades. That is not the signature of an invention. That is the signature of an inheritance being forgotten. The mainstream explanation is that Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers who gathered seasonally for ritual, and that the labor demands of building it are what pushed them into agriculture. It's a genuinely elegant idea. It inverts the old model. The temple came first, and the farm came second, because you had to feed the work crews. But that explanation has a problem. The wild ancestor of modern wheat, einkorn, has been genetically traced to a mountain range about 30 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe. Domesticated wheat appears in the archaeological record right around there, right around then. So we have the world's first monumental architecture and the world's first domesticated grain emerging in the same small patch of southeastern Turkey, in the same window immediately after the most violent climate reversal in human memory. Either that's the greatest coincidence in prehistory, or something arrived there. Plato's priest said the survivors of the flood fled to the mountains. He said the ones who lived were herdsmen on the high ground, that everyone with skill and knowledge lived in the lowlands and the cities. And the lowlands are precisely what the sea took. So what survives a global flood is the people with the least technical knowledge, and whatever fragments the refugees carried up with them. Göbekli Tepe sits at 760 meters above sea level. Now, let's slow down and be honest. Does any of this prove Plato's Atlantis was real? No, it doesn't. Göbekli Tepe is not Atlantis. It is a religious complex in Anatolia, and there is nothing at that site that says it was built by refugees from anywhere. The most likely reading remains the boring. 1. Local people, local development, a genuinely brilliant local culture we badly underestimated. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is contested, and being contested is not the same as being suppressed. Sea level rise of 120 meters is real and settled, and it drowned coastlines everywhere, which means a flood story is not evidence of one particular flood. Every culture on Earth has one, because every culture on Earth watched the water come. And Plato's 9,000 years may simply be an Egyptian number, inflated for effect, that happened to land somewhere interesting. All of that is fair. All of that is probably right. But the grounded version is still extraordinary because even the boring reading requires this, that 11,600 years ago, people we call hunter-gatherers organized hundreds of workers, quarried 16-ton pillars, moved them without wheels or draft animals, carved them with a mature artistic vocabulary that has no precursor, arranged them in precise rings, and then, 16 centuries later, buried the entire thing under tons of fill by hand. And it requires that they did it in the exact century when the planet's climate flipped and the oceans took 120 meters of the human world. If those two facts are connected, our history is missing a chapter. It would mean the story we tell, that civilization began in Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE, and everything before that was scattered bands chasing animals, is off by more than 5,000 years. It would mean the flood myths are not myths. It would mean the Egyptian priests at Sais were not telling Solon a legend. They were reading him an archive. They weren't guessing. They were remembering. And here is the part that should bother you most. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014. Before he died, he said something that has never been resolved. Geophysical surveys, ground-penetrating radar, and magnetometry had already mapped what lies under the rest of that hill. The surveys found at least 16 more enclosures. Some estimates run higher. More rings, more pillars, standing where they were left. Excavation has touched a fraction of the site. Schmidt himself said it would take 50 years, and he was fine with that because he believed future archaeologists would have better tools and would do less damage. So, most of Göbekli Tepe was deliberately left in the ground. It is still there. Tonight, under a hill in Anatolia, dozens of stone rings are standing in the dark exactly where someone deliberately buried them 11,000 years ago, carved by hands that we cannot name. In the century, the oceans rose. Nobody has looked. The radar knows they're there. Whatever those builders were trying to hide or trying to save is still waiting. If you want to know what else the ancient world buried and we were told to walk past, watch the next investigation on screen right now.